Thank you, Claire, and a very warm welcome also from me to the Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture. This is a little bit special this year because in addition to the lecturer, who you will, I know, find a fantastic speaker, we're also honouring our University Challenge team, which won this year, and their coach. So a very warm welcome particularly to them and their friends and family, to the family of Sir John Cockcroft, who is here, and of course to our lecturer, James Thompson, and his guests. But a warm welcome to all of you. This is our flagship alumni event of the year, and it's a time when we not only hear outstanding presentations, but we also celebrate the great work of our alumni. I was told the other day that apparently we have, in theory, 400,000 alumni across the world. So you represent a small but very important snapshot of those. You really do make a significant contribution to this university. Many of you mentor students, offer them workplaces, even do professional speed dating, I understand. Some of you come back onto campus to tell them about your experiences, to support them and advise them. And next week on our open day, some of you are coming to meet prospective students. Of course, some of our alumni also generously donate to the university to a number of causes, one of which is the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute, which James is going to be speaking about today. Another of the important causes that alumni support is our Manchester Access programme, which helps students to get to university, particularly those who might not have otherwise thought of going to university. And we're joined today by some sixth formers who are on the Manchester Access programme. Put your hands up, down at the front. So you might hope you're going to come to this university, but you may go to some university, and then in the future you will be alumni also, and I'm sure that you will be supported by both students current at the university and those who in the past. So the lecture is particularly important, and its name signifies the importance we place on our history. Sir John Cockcroft was a very famous alumnus of this university. Lord Ernest Rutherford was indeed a member of our staff. Both won Nobel Prizes in physics. And any of you who hear about the news in the university will realise that physics is also flourishing today, with 2 Nobel laureates, a Regius Professor announced, a square kilometre array, major funding, and of course Brian Cox, who helps us a little. So it's appropriate that one of our University Challenge winning team is studying physics and astrophysics. So I'm going to come back in a moment to the Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture, but I do want to take this occasion for us to honour our winning team, and I'm going to ask them to come up to the stage while I say just a few words. So if you'd like to come up, Richard Gilbert, the captain, Adam Barr, David Bryce, So just a very brief few words of background on the team. Richard, Adam, David, Debbie, and of course their coach, Stephen Pearson. Stephen already has the Medal of Honour because you may remember that we also won last year. Not to put too fine a point on it. So Richard is a linguist and was not going to take part in the competition at all. In fact, we were told that he was persuaded by his girlfriend that he should give it a go. And in the end, he got the right answers to the highest number of starter questions, particularly good on geography, I understand. Adam Barr, physics and astronomy, also nearly didn't take place because he didn't realise that he got one of the highest ever scores for a first-year undergraduate early in the selection process. And in fact, he nearly missed out on joining and was chased by the frantic organisers. I'm told that he even impressed Jeremy Paxman. He did this because apparently he calculated the coefficient of x cubed on the polynomial expansion of the expression x plus 1, all raised to the power of 5, and as you all know, the answer's 10. Nice to see Jeremy Paxman impressed by Manchester. David Bryce is in his final year in economics and would probably rather I didn't mention his opening to the beginning of the series, where he interrupted the first starter with the wrong answer. But he had a breadth of knowledge in covering thermodynamics and poetry, and he even answered the starter question on what's the closest state in the United States in area to the United Kingdom, and thankfully he just visited his aunt who gave him the right answer. Debbie Brown was then in a final year PhD, so she is now Dr. Debbie Brown, and in fact this is her fourth degree. She's been an undergraduate in engineering and physiotherapy and has a master's in aging, health and disease, and is studying for under diploma in health and safety, and is studying now for a degree in arts, and which she hopes to complete in a couple of years. And again, very high scores in the selection. So people ask me what's really stressful about being a Vice-Chancellor in a university, and I think for a moment, and of course it's whether our students are well and happy, student applications, finances, what the government's going to do to us next. But there was little that was as stressful as the first match in this series. I rushed from a university event to turn the television on halfway through, and we'd barely scored. With apparently only 3 minutes left, we were down by 100 to 175, and we were just chatting about this before. Not only were we clearly going to have no chance of winning, but it was going to be the most dismal defeat ever. Those of you who watched it will know that they then got a series of starters and follow-up questions right, and got the right question, the answer to the final question, winning by 5 points just as the gong went. Thankfully, they didn't put us through that again. They had victories against Magdalen, Oxford, Imperial, St George's, Bangor, and then met University College London in the final, although they had been beaten by UCL in the quarter-final. But they eventually won 190 to 140, and that makes the second win in a year, 2 years running, and the fourth win in 8 years. I think you will agree that they're very worthy recipients of our Medal of Honour, and I'm now going to present the awards. Thank you. Congratulations. Finally, Stephen. Now, Stephen was a member of a winning team in the university. He's now a university librarian, and he's successfully coached many University of Manchester teams, such that he's even now referred to as the Alex Ferguson of University Challenge. The rumours that he's been headhunted by other universities, if true, I can say that we've managed to fight them off, thankfully, because not only is he a great coach, but also a very important member of our library. And he does the selection, he helps the team along. He says, of course, they do the winning, but I'm sure he has a little bit to do with it. And so a small token. Stephen, congratulations. So Richard's going to just say a few words on behalf of the team and Stephen.
Thank you. Bear with me a sec. Right, thank you very much for all these awards. Very, very grateful. Just going to say a few words about our experiences and how the team was picked and how we ended up here on a stage in front of the alumni. My being here tonight personally was a close run thing, as Dame Nancy's already said. Such is the prestige of US Challenge and Manchester's formidable record in it, that you assume that the calibre of people involved is truly exceptional, and it's for the uniquely gifted. Having met the rest of my team and Stephen, I was relieved to know that's not actually the case. Yeah, these meetings wouldn't have happened, actually, had it would not be for my girlfriend, because I almost didn't go. But Polly made me Nagging is the word I used. I've been told to say it's firm encouragement, but it was nagging. The first round of the selection process was 100 questions we will have to do. We turn up, if you see the emails, and general knowledge that ranges from quite broad things, from belligerence of military campaigns in the past to the real name of Lady Gaga, who was a pop star. They knew. Having no idea what you're going to be up against, you can't really gauge your own score, how well you've done. So I made Stephen sort of mark mine there and then. And, having made him give me a mark for a question about US politics, the answer was House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives. I wrote Speaker of the House, and he didn't want to give me the mark, but I made him, because there aren't that many other speakers in other houses. That was my argument. But I got invited back to the second round, which involves about a dozen of us sitting with buzzers in a room answering questions for roughly 45 minutes. And in this time, I realised there was a chap called David, who was very good at his classical music. There was an astrophysicist called Adam Barr, who could answer questions on military campaigns, as well as on quasars and neutron stars. And there was a lady called Debbie, who knew everything. After the first 5 minutes, they also knew there was a chap called Richard who knew that zebras were stripy horses. I luckily caught up with them, and after about a week of waiting, I got an email from Stephen saying, would I like to be captain? I'm not sure why I was chosen. I think it was something to do with the fact that he was impressed that I got an answer to a question. The answer was Thelma and Louise, and the only bit of the question I heard was, what 1991 road moved me? There aren't many other road movies in 1991, that's how I knew it. We did these training sessions that we've heard about, and a lot's been made of them. They sound like these arduous sort of workouts like you'd imagine in Rocky. With incorrect answers punished by cold showers and the rod. Even though that's how I'd have done them, Stephen's a bit more laid back. And basically it involves matches against the University Challenge teams of the past, we're very grateful for helping us. Some of them are here now, there's Adam Clark, Paul Joyce and Mike McKenna, amongst others who've come to help us out. And we learn how to buzz, and we learn who to rely on for different answers to different questions. So, who's going to know a question about X, who's going to know about Y, who to ignore. Because, some people don't know as much as they think they do. That's me. But crucially, these are social events where people who enjoy quizzes like us could gather and quiz without the fear of judgment and persecution from greater society, and then go to the pub. I won't go into detail about what happened on the show, because I imagine most of you all who've seen it when it was broadcast and then watched it again on iPlayer. And if you want DVDs, I have dozens that you can watch to your heart's content. Nancy's already mentioned our first round, which I wasn't going to go into at all, when we were 100 points behind and looked set to crash out, having our names struck from university records, for us to claw our way back in the last minute. But I won't be mentioning that on advice from my therapist. Suffice to say, it all worked out in the end. It's difficult to describe the feeling having won, because it was quite a while ago. And there's no fallout. After you've won, you have to wait a year before you can even talk about it with anyone. So being somewhere like this, it feels like it might have been actually worth it, and we're all very grateful. We've been on BBC Breakfast, so we're all minor celebrities. We went to Town Hall where we got little badges. And now we're here, which I think is the icing on the cake with these wonderful medals. And we're very, very grateful, and we're still waiting for the open-top bus parade, which can only be weeks away. But on behalf of the team, I'd like to thank everybody involved in giving us these medals, everyone who helped support us, friends and family, but particularly Stephen Pearson up here as well, without whose hard work, none of this would ever happen. And I can only think that we're going to go strength to strength with Stephen still here. So, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. We're all very proud of you. We'll have that open-top bus arranged as soon as possible. So now just a few words about our Cockcroft Rutherford Lecturer this year, James Thompson, who is Professor of Applied and Social Drama and also Associate Dean for External Activities in the Faculty of Humanities. I won't give you all of James's background, but in 1992 he set up Theatre in Prisons and Probation Research, a centre at the University of Manchester. And from 1992 to 1999 he was director of that centre and involved in teaching. He joined the university full-time in 1999 and he is now director of In Place of War and executive director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. This really, James has developed, delivered, championed a number of arts projects in areas of conflict and disaster across the world, and I'm sure he's going to tell you about some of these. So his contribution to the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute is extremely important. We're very proud of HCRI, which is driven by a desire to inform policy and decision makers, to optimise partner organisations to work together, to increase understanding and debate in the field of humanitarianism. And it's something that we feel is very important in the university because it brings together staff in very different disciplines, emergency medicine, humanities, and of course, in James's case, in drama. And it's a centre of excellence in research and in teaching, which has major human impact. James is an author of many acclaimed books and a great contributor to many aspects of the university. Many of you will know that the university has three core goals: world-class research, outstanding teaching, and social responsibility. That is making a difference. James exemplifies all of those in one person since he contributes to all three. And I'm delighted to invite James to present In Place of War.
Thank you very much to Nancy. Thank you very much to the Alumni Association for inviting me to give tonight's Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture. It's about a project called In Place of War, which is part of the Department of Drama here at the university and also a project of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. And tonight I'm going to talk about the project and more broadly about the whole relationship between art and war. My lecture is going to start with an invitation and a book. The invitation came at the end of 1999 from UNICEF in Sri Lanka. They invited me to go to northern Sri Lanka to run a series of theatre training projects with staff members who worked with children who had been adversely affected by the conflict in that country. My first overhead projection of the night is this. This is the map of Sri Lanka. That's about as technical as I get, but this is the map of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a palm-shaped island just at the tip of India, about 65,000 kilometers square. And in 2000, it was experiencing a protracted civil war that had started in really 1984. The island, and excuse me, I should present this around here, my overhead projection. The island is broadly divided between the north and the east, which is a Tamil area. They're predominantly Hindu with a minority Catholic. And then the south and the west, which is Sinhalese, majority Buddhist with a minority Christian. There is also a Muslim minority who speak Tamil. I was invited to the very north of the country, in the centre of the area where the civil war was taking place, to run this series of training projects. Second part of my introduction, the book. I am a very well-behaved academic, so I realised if I was going to Sri Lanka to do some work on theatre, I ought to find out something about Sri Lankan theatre. I hadn't done this sort of research before. I went to our fantastic John Rylands University Library. I looked up, I think it was card indexes rather on the computer. This was 1999. Someone can shout out and tell me whether it was computerized at that time. And I found one book, and this is the book. Well, it's actually not the book. This is my personal copy of the book. I've not kept it for 10 years, otherwise I would be in major trouble. But this is my copy of a book that I found in the university library. It's called Sri Lankan Theatre in Time of Terror, a really cheerful title. And in fact, this book is about theatre in the southern part of Sri Lanka in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when there was a terrible uprising and civil war in the southern part of the island. Now, I was going to the northern, the Tamil area of the country, so I desperately looked in this book to see if there was anything written about northern Sri Lankan Tamil theatre. I've marked it. And there is one paragraph. And what it says is, because of the war, there is next to no, almost no theatre in the north of the country. Because of the war, there is no theatre in the north of the country. So, I go to the north of the country to run my series of training workshops for UNICEF, and I discover how fundamentally wrong this assessment was. There was a hugely diverse, dynamic, very innovative theatre community working in the northern part of the island. For a start, back to my overhead projection, here in the town of Jaffna, the University of Jaffna has one of the only theatre studies departments in the whole of the island. Therefore, there were theatre lecturers, a huge sway of theatre students. In the centre, I'll put my overhead projection down. In the centre of the town, there was a major theatre with an outdoor auditorium where you could fit 300 to 500 people for big performances. There was a street theatre movement. There was a political theatre movement. And most interestingly for me, there was a really dynamic children's theatre movement. And that, the very reason for that, was because the best directors, the best playwrights, had been forced to relocate themselves to schools. In the evenings, after curfew, you couldn't rehearse. You had to go back home. And it was very difficult to find venues to rehearse. So the best playwrights, the best directors were working with the youngest people in the schools. And what emerged from that process was this wonderfully dynamic theatre for young people, which toured all around that area. So I was faced with two questions. The first question was, why were people in the middle of this very intensive civil war continuing to prioritise making theatre? Why were they doing that? And the second question was, why did an academic writing her book about theatre in Sri Lanka assume that they were not? So why were they doing it? And why did an academic assume that they were not going to do it? These are the first two questions that we developed into the In Place of War project. But then there was a third question. The third question came about almost a year later, September the 11th, 2001. The terrible events in New York meant that a lot of artists, academics, were asking questions about what is the most appropriate response to those monumental, terrible events. How should artists appropriately respond to these events? Most of the response, certainly in North America and certainly in Europe, was to go back in history to discover the best way that we can learn how artists should respond, to go back to our collective past, to look when else artists have responded to war, to see if we can learn from them. They did a sort of timeline. This is my timeline here. Far back, Greek theatre. Anyone who studied Greek theatre knows that the Greeks concentrated on putting wars on stage. 441 BC, Antigone, written by Sophocles. This is a debate about the relationship between morality and law. Antigone wants to bury her brother, but he fought on the wrong side of the civil war, and therefore the law says she cannot bury him. So they stage that debate between law and morality in the drama. Moving forward a small bit, 415 BC, Euripides writes Trojan Women. Now, anyone who knows Trojan Women, it's a really gory play. It's the play where they throw babies off ramparts. But the Greeks never showed you the babies being thrown off the ramparts. The tactic for the Greeks was to keep the violence off the stage and just deal with the impact of that violence on the lives and the community of the people. So you don't see the violence. Their choice as artists was not to represent the violence. A big leap, about just over 2,000 years. I'll deal with something in the middle in a bit, but that's later on. For now, over 2,000 years later, I've arrived in 1810. Between 1810 and 1820, Francisco Goya, Spanish artist, created 82 prints called The Disasters of War. And these were his response to the Peninsular War, which was happening between 1808 and 1814. Just a little aside, the reason I'm giving these dates and trying to impress you with my knowledge of dates is directed at the University Challenge team. It's a very subtle way of auditioning for next year's team, but I assume that I'm not allowed to actually join in. But anyway, Goya saw his role as reporter. He was the documenter of the war. And his job was to represent the impact of the war on the lives of ordinary people. About 100 years later, 1914 to 1918, First World War, and we arrive at poetry. What passing bells for these that die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out these hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmer of goodbyes, and the pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk, the drawing down of blinds. This is a sonnet called Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen. People have asked me, how come the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute here in the university has artists and medics working together at the centre? You only have to look at the history of the relationship between shell shock, psychiatric responses to mental health in war, and poetry to show that there's always been an intimate connection. (1937), Germany bombs the Basque town of Guernica. And Pablo Picasso, the artist, creates his monumental response. Now, this is not reportage, it's not Goya. This is outrage. For Picasso, famously he said, painting is not about decorating apartments. It's an instrument of war. For Picasso, art making is an intervention. It's an intervention in the war itself. I'm getting to the end of the stage here. So you know it doesn't go on for much longer. 1939, a couple of years later, Germany invades Poland. The German playwright Bertolt Brecht writes his play Mother Courage and Her Children. a play that is an indictment of the opportunism of some during wartime. Brecht famously said, he asked himself a question, in fact. He says, will there be singing in these dark times? And he replies to his own question. He says, yes, there will also be singing about these dark times. For Brecht, the playwright, the job of the artist was to criticize, to comment on the experience of war. Tiny bit of space left. 1962. Benjamin Britten, the composer, is commissioned to create his war requiem in response for the new consecration of Coventry Cathedral, a requiem which for him is dedicated to the dead of both world wars. Here, the artistic response is about commemoration. It's about marking people's passing, but also marking a point moving forward into the future. Now, this history is something that people assume, if you're answering the question, what should artists do, this is what we draw on. For the In Place of War project, we decided not to draw on it. So I've just told you all that and now said that I'm not going to do it. The In Place of War project decided instead that we were going to go geographically. And the reason was that experience in Sri Lanka. We had a hunch, a hypothesis. If there are artists working in northern Sri Lanka where they're not meant to be working, we bet there are artists working in similar locations internationally, and actually we could learn something from their experience. If we want to know how should artists respond to contemporary acts of terror, suffering, or major events, why don't we go and find what artists are doing today and see if we can learn from their existing experiences? So this is exactly what the In Place of War project has done. With my colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, myself, we started a process of documenting the work of artists living in contemporary war zones. We visited internationally to Rwanda, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Israel, Palestine, Kosovo, Northern Ireland. And we also brought those artists to here in Manchester to give them an opportunity to share their experiences and learn from each other. We ran international conferences, one in here in Manchester, one on the stage of the National Theatre in Kosovo, and another one in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. All the time trying to give these artists an opportunity to learn from each other, but also to support our work in trying to discover how artists should or might respond to contemporary conflicts. I want to give you 3 examples of the projects we discovered in this process. One from the Democratic Republic of Congo, one from Sri Lanka again, and one from Kosovo. Now, this is an image of Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, if you think I can do this for Sri Lanka, I need some volunteers. Sorry. I am a theatre lecturer, so clearly audience participation is part of the gig, basically. I think the University Challenge team would be very good at this. All you have to do, can you just all come forward and stand just here? I need 4 of you. The team. So sorry, apologies to the people at the front. You can just, if you don't mind turning your heads. And you 4, you can just face the audience. It's very simple. Shoulder to shoulder. Yeah. Yes, he's getting the idea. If this is Sri Lanka, this is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Sri Lanka, about 65,000 kilometers squared. Congo, more than 2,300,000 kilometers squared. If some geographer in the audience now tells me that no, the proportions are wrong, I'd be really annoyed. So, okay? But broadly, the Atlantic Ocean over here. My friends here are the Atlantic Ocean. with Kinshasa about the shoulder here, maybe a bit low, about your elbow, with the Congo River going over their heads. Congo River going over the heads, so we've got the Republic of Congo down here. We've got Central African Republic here, a bit of Southern Sudan here. Going down this lovely suit that he's wearing here is Uganda, and just about his hip, sorry, just about your hip is Rwanda and then Burundi. And going down his leg is Lake Tanganyika. I bet you've never been told that you've got Lake Tanganyika down your leg. Sorry. And just therefore, over the other side of his leg, where I'm standing, is Tanzania. But Lake Tanganyika's here. Now, many people will know that the war in Eastern Congo started really with a genocide in Rwanda about here. Sorry to keep pointing at his hip. And after 1994, many hundreds of thousands of Hutu members of the community fled into Eastern Congo. And the disruption of their arrival in Eastern Congo over many years led to the Congolese War, started really in 1996, through to the early 2000s. A war in which the estimates are between 3 and perhaps some estimates say up to 5 million people died, with many of the countries across their heads getting involved. So the countries to the north, Uganda to the west, and so forth, being involved in what was called Africa's World War. Round of applause again for this lot. They can sit down. Now, this is Uvira. This is just where, before his leg went down into Lake Tanganyika. In Eastern Congo, there is an organization called Search for Common Ground. Search for Common Ground run a center called Centre Le Collet. And it's a center that develops media training, runs radio stations, and seeks to develop peace-building programs for the whole eastern area of Sri Lanka. A quick example of a program linked to their program, this is a performance piece by a group of widows in South Kivu area in eastern Congo. One part of Search for Common Ground's work is to work with something called a participatory theatre troupe. The participatory theatre troupe work with programs about demobilized soldiers, but also programs for refugees. During the war, many communities fled. I'm pointing to the leg over there when I do this. Many communities fled across Lake Tanganyika and lived in refugee camps in Tanzania. Once the peace deals were signed in the early 2000s, many wanted to return. The participatory theatre group would meet them off the boat. They would return back to their villages and then research with those communities about the different issues that they were facing. They would then create public performances about the issues that those returned refugees were facing. These are performances that posed some of the micro-conflict problems that were emerging. One of the things that happens when you return to your community, having been a refugee, is that you might discover someone's now living in your house. Someone's farming your field. But also the returning refugees came with a UN kit, seeds, basic foodstuffs, hose, cooking materials. They came with equipment that people in the village did not have. So local level jealousies and small level conflicts started to emerge. This participatory theatre group performs these problems to public audiences and encourages those audiences to develop public debate about these issues and start to try and publicly resolve some of these issues. And you'll see here a performance in an area called Goma in North Kivu, which is a performance about people returning to their communities and discovering someone now claims ownership of their land. These performances are powerful because it's a process of problem solving. But they're also powerful more simplistically, perhaps, as an exhibition of the end of war. It's a public statement that now we can assemble. Now we can celebrate being together, and now we can do things publicly which we could not do before the war started. So there is something about these that it's a return of public culture that is very impressive. And a sheer just indication of one level of the audiences that come for these events. Many thousands of people assemble, and that would not have been possible prior to the peace deal being signed. Second example, back to my easier map. This is from eastern Sri Lanka, by my thumb. In eastern Sri Lanka, the civil war was somewhat different. It was much more sort of based on guerrilla warfare, much more low-lying, but also more disturbing for the communities in that area. There is a performance form in this area called kutu. It's a dance form. During the wartime, it almost completely disappeared because it is traditionally performed at night. And in a curfew-ridden area, you can't leave your home after 6 o'clock. So over many years, the opportunity to perform this dance had disappeared. Now, kutu, you can see a man here about to start his dance. Kutu is a performance that uses the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And what they started to do is they wanted to, after the peace deal was signed, 2002, to start to enable these communities to develop the performance again. And they worked in a number of the sort of fishing communities around eastern Sri Lanka, starting to rebuild the skill base so people could learn this performance. And what you see here is one of the theatre workshops, dance workshops that started to be developed in people's backyards, outside temples, and so forth. The group that developed this was called Third Eye. What they were trying to do is two things explicitly and one thing implicitly. Explicitly, in this community, there had been a great marginalisation of girls and women during the wartime. And in fact, girls and women were not allowed to participate in the kutu dance form. Gradually, by reintroducing these workshops and these dance groups, as you can see from this image, young girls were allowed to start participating, to start being part of this form. And you can see here, they started to participate very strongly. The second reason they give for doing this project of work is that the way the Mahabharata and the Ramayana represent low-caste communities is extremely derogatory. Low-caste communities in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana tend to be the fool, the drunkard, the village idiot. And what Third Eye sought to do was to reformulate the scripts so the communities who were themselves low-caste had an opportunity to start representing themselves in a different way. But there was a third reason that they were doing this work. Anyone here who knows the Ramayana and Mahabharata will know that it's about war. These stories are about the dilemmas of returning to war and the impact of war on families. And often the performances and excerpts from these Hindu epics they chose to do were about crucial dilemmas of war making. If you ask them, so this excerpt is about the war, isn't it? They'd say, no, 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 no. This is our Hindu epics. It's just accidentally about the war. In this community, you could not explicitly talk about the conflict. During the time that I was there, the local MP, on Christmas Day, celebrating Mass, he was a Catholic, was shot in his pew. This is a place where public leaders, people who express themselves openly, who try and take a position on the conflict, were in mortal danger. They therefore presented their performances as statements about the war that were not statements. These were public events where the war they knew was being discussed, but no one was making an explicit commentary. My third example comes from Kosovo. If this is Sri Lanka, but actually that's really, the geographer I'm expecting to shout at me now, because Sri Lanka is about 65,000 kilometres square, Kosovo is about 10,000 kilometres square, so it's about this little bit of my fingers down here, but it's roughly this shape. Now, many of you will know that the war in Kosovo really started prior to 1999 in a dispute and a sort of rebellion between the majority Albanian-speaking Kosovars and the Serbian government. So if this is Kosovo, the country, of course, the Republic of Serbia is above them here. In 1999, NATO bombed both Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, and also Belgrade and Serbia. And eventually, the end of the war comes with the EU and NATO taking control of the soon-to-be independent Republic of Kosovo. It became independent in 2008. Just after the war, there were about 5,000 people missing. About 4,000 Kosovar Albanians and approximately 1,000 Serbs. In Pristina, the UN had an office called the Office for Missing People and Forensics. Their job was to disinter bodies and return those bodies to their families. In the first part of the period after the war, they struggled to do this. They struggled because people would not accept that their loved ones were dead. For the Albanian community, they assumed their loved ones were still alive in prisons in Belgrade. For the Serbian community, they assumed that their loved ones were in secret prisons in Pristina. In fact, there was a black market in information about your family members. Someone would come to your door, knock on your door, and show you a flyer with a list of names, and your son or your husband's name, predominantly men, was on this list. And they'd say, this is a list of a prison in Belgrade. If you give me $100, I will find you some more evidence that your son is alive. And people played on that sense of insecurity and made money from that sense of insecurity. The Office for Missing People and Forensics decided to commission something called the Centre for Children's Theatre and Development. They commissioned a theatre organisation to create a play that sort of brought forward the problems of missing people to the communities who were affected by it. Originally, they wanted a dual language play in Albanian and Serbian that would tour the province to the different missing people's associations, schools, and so forth. The Albanian community immediately said, if there is a single word of Serbian in this production, we will have nothing to do with it. The Serbian community said immediately, if there is a single word of Albanian in this production, we will have nothing to do with it. They created 2 plays. They created, therefore, an Albanian language play that toured the different missing people's associations, and they created a Serbian language play that toured the other associations. And this is just an image from that performance. It was a very simple play that tried to raise the issues of why communities were not prepared to come forward to identify their loved ones. One of the crucial reasons is that you have to give blood. If your husband is missing, clearly you cannot give blood. It has to be your son or your daughter or a blood relative of the person missing. And many of these performance pieces were simple dialogues between family members debating whether they would go forward to help identify their loved ones. And these plays toured a whole range of different venues, very small, very intimate, and some larger school-type venues. And here you'll see the sort of venues that took place with a Missing People's Association listening into the stage drama and then developing a community-wide discussion about this issue. This is called the Voices Project. And many people put down the gradual success of the Office for Missing People and Forensics to projects such as these. But clearly, you see from this image, many of the discussions after these performances were extremely painful. What I want to do next is do some links between this project and broader disciplines involved in the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute. I'm going to give you 6 What I say really are some of the theoretical or problems faced by doing research such as these. And that will lead to the end of the lecture. These 6 start with the relationship between time and place. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to move again, but I promise there's no volunteers involved in this place. You'll have to bear with me. To understand the relationship between time and place, you need to think of this room as a large graph. So up and down here is the measurement of time, and along here is the measurement of space. Here is 0, 0. Here is the time and space of war. The bombs are falling on my head now in my house. So this is 0 point time, 0 point space. As we move up here, we move ahead in time. The bombs happened yesterday. Up here, the bombs happened last week. The war was a week ago. The war was a month ago. Last year, there was a war in my community. As we get up here, the war was many years ago. People living in London today thinking about the Blitz, if you experience the Blitz, are up here. They're in the place of war, but they've travelled a long way from it. So that's one axis, and the other axis is space. So we go from, it's happening in my town, on my head now, it's happening in the village next door. It's happening in the town next door because I've run away from that town, and it's happening over there. Going back to his leg and Lake Tanganyika. They've run across the Lake Tanganyika to live in refugee camps there because the war's happening in their homeland over there. As you move down here, people have travelled further and further and further. There's a Congolese community here in Manchester. The Congolese community in Manchester, when the war is still happening in the Congo, are over here. They've travelled thousands of miles to get away from the war in that place. What we noticed in our project is that where you were on this matrix changed the sort of project that you could do and the sort of artistic response there was. There were projects here. When the bombs were falling on people's head, there were artistic responses. Unsurprisingly, when the bombs are falling on your head, the artistic response has got nothing to do with the war. People don't want to talk about war when the bombs are falling on their head. They want to do anything but. If you sing in the shelter when the bombs are falling on your head, you do not sing songs about war. You sing about anything but. So there are lots of projects here, but they're not about war. And then you can plot different projects across this graph. You will notice projects change according to where people are. There's friends in the middle over here, where people have travelled a bit of time, a bit of space away from a war, but it's a few years later from the war. And many of the artistic projects happen in this middle zone. It's much harder for some of the projects to happen here. What we notice is there's a failure to allow people to recognise there's different demands according to where you are. Lots of people might insist, well, there should be this sort of artistic response, but actually people are not able to respond in particular ways depending where they exist on this large map. That was number one. The second one is the relationship between justice and reconciliation. We notice lots of people condense these two words together when describing the sort of projects they do. It's about justice and reconciliation. And what we started to discover that you could not put them together that easily. If you had a reconciliation project here, sometimes you had to suspend the demand for justice. There are projects, arts projects in Rwanda between Tutsis and Hutus. In order for them to come together in that project, the Tutsi community actually had to suspend some of their existing demands for justice. And similarly over here, There are justice projects, projects demanding the justice for a particular community, particular group, particular ethnic group in an area. And what you notice is to make the demand for justice, the opportunity for reconciliation also have to be suspended. So there's a tension between these two. Number three is the notion of remembrance. There are many projects that are about remembering, giving testimony to a past experience. Often this is to do with therapeutic projects, where people are encouraged to give a narrative or a story about the suffering of their community. Many people assume most arts projects exist here. It's a project of commemoration, remembrance of past suffering. What we noticed in the research is that there are as many projects over here which are projects about forgetting. It's projects about a community's right to silence, not their right to speak out. Many communities choose all sorts of different ways to express their suffering. And many of these ways are about forgetting what has happened, not about acting to remember it. And this is often counterintuitive to many of the projects, particularly many of the mental health projects that exist over here. My fourth one, with apologies to anyone who speaks Brazilian Portuguese. Raise your hand now. Fantastic. Sopra inglês ver. Sopra inglês ver is a Brazilian Portuguese expression meaning only for the English to see. Now, this expression comes from the history of the abolition of slavery. When the British warships policed the abolition, they arrived in the port of Rio de Janeiro, they looked at the quayside, and they hoped they would see no evidence of the selling of slaves. And the Brazilians cleared up the quayside and showed it to be a normal place with no market in slaves. Of course, what the Brazilians did is they took those markets inland. And the slave markets continued, but out of sight of the British warships. And the expression in Brazilian Portuguese came to be, só para inglês ver. We're going to do something just for the English to see. And it just means things done for show. Things done to impress somebody when it's not actually true. What we noticed in the research projects on art and war, and more broadly for humanitarian projects generally, is there is a tendency for some projects to be about how they impress external audiences more than the care they're trying to show that the people they're working with. There are many projects, for example, with children, where it's about the performance of those children to an international audience and not actually for the children themselves. One of the devastating things after the tsunami in Sri Lanka was the sheer volume of international aid money that went to supporting the building of orphanages. A colleague of mine was asked to count the number of orphans in the southwest of the island in doing a needs assessment. She found 5 orphans. Children died in the tsunami. They can't swim. Actually, the survivors tended to be adult, middle-aged men. But the projects that got the international funding were projects for young children and orphans, so the orphanages were built, and children went to them, and the photo opportunities came about, and they were therefore done só para inglês ver, just for the international community to see. Now, some of these projects are absolutely worthy, but it's really important we think who the audience for our humanitarian care is. Is it really for the needs of the community you're working for, or is it done for a particular impression that we have about what should be done? My 5th point. You'll notice when I did the timeline along here, very conveniently, I jumped from the Greeks to Goya. I'm famous for being the British professor of theatre who knows the least about Shakespeare. So I have to jump over this bit. And this is my dread of the university challenge, because if I got asked a question about it would be terrible. But anyway, in the middle here, we noticed a particular disease in arts projects in international war zones, and we came to call that disease Romeo and Julietism. There was extreme forms called Romeo and Julietitis. And this was the tendency for every single project to take the narrative of Romeo and Juliet and create some happy resolution about these two warring parties. Terrible choice of play, because they die in the end. But that aside. And we got the Hutu Romeo and the Tutsi Juliet, the Israeli Romeo with the Palestinian Juliet, the Northern Irish Protestant loyalist Romeo with the Northern Irish Republican Catholic Juliet. Time and time again, the same narrative. What we started to realize is this narrative actually causes more harm often than good. Because all it does is restate the division that is in that community. And by continually stating that this is the division that affects this community, you in fact maintain that as the real division. For many communities, there are other important divisions. If you're working in the Gaza Strip, it might be between Islamic and secular Palestinians. If you're working in Northern Ireland, it might be between urban and rural people from Northern Ireland. But this Romeo and Juliet narrative doesn't allow communities to find other divisions to concentrate on. And it certainly doesn't allow them to do work in single communities, which might be necessary. My final point. We noticed time and again, when asking people what sort of work they want to do, many artists, many communities simply said, we want to do work that is beautiful. We want to do work that is joyous. Now, as a person trained in the academy here in the UK or the US, this is against our instinct. Against our instinct for two very clear reasons. Everyone is trained in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow wrote a paper in 1943 which showed that there's a hierarchy of human need, starting with food, accommodation, moving through safety, and eventually what he called self-actualization, the ability to start creating things and be creative and being an artist. According to Maslow, you have to deal with all these bottom things first before you go on to be an artist. You need to fill your belly, you need to be safe. You can't be thinking about beauty when the shells are falling. Similarly, another reason that we are suspicious of the notion of beauty comes from, I'm back on my timeline here, 1945, just after the Second World War. The German sociologist and musicologist Theodor Adorno, he famously said, after Auschwitz, all art is rubbish. Another version of that is, after Auschwitz, all poetry is barbaric. For Adorno, the very act of creating art in response to war was an insult to the suffering of the people who had been through that war. Art could not possibly respond and give those people their dignity. But what we noticed is both Maslow and Adorno in this case were wrong. Very simply, people repeatedly said, we want something beautiful. We want celebration. We want joy. And in fact, we noticed that it was the way that many communities found safety. It's a way that people sustained themselves through wars. It's the way that people found something separate, different, that kept them alive when all around them was so terrible. So rather than being disparaging about this demand for beauty, we should welcome it and say that art is perhaps fundamental to the way people live and work and survive terrible events. I want to end with where the In Place of War project is today. What we're trying to do today is create an online community so that artists can share their work, so that they can learn from each other, and they can also archive and store their work so that it can inspire future generations. This new stage has been particularly inspired by some of the artistic work in response to the Arab Spring. And we're now working with some technology companies to try and create this online platform. I'm going to show you a very short video that describes the work of this new online part of this project, and then that will end the lecture.
We think of wars as cruel, inhuman, dangerous and ugly, places where it's impossible to live with dignity. But people from sites of war, conflict or humanitarian disaster still continue to live their lives, bring up their families, go to school, travel to work, and often, if they are artists, they continue to create and frequently respond to the situations in which they find themselves. In Place of War is a project for these artists. It supports, documents, and showcases their work, their creative response to those dangerous and ugly places. The resulting work is extraordinary, often angry and passionate, sometimes gentle or beautiful. Inspired by artists' work, In Place of War has created a digital platform, an online meeting place for artists to share their response to war, unrest and conflict, and view and learn from the work of others. From street artists in Libya to theatre makers in the Democratic Republic of Congo to musicians in Sierra Leone and dance groups in Sri Lanka, a site for all artists who seek to respond to, resist, or simply cope with the challenges they face, to share work, discover work, and connect. The platform is for everyone to learn about an unseen part of the experience of war and suffering, and connect with others across the world at the same time. The In Place of War platform allows artists to showcase their work, automatically broadcasting it to the world across multiple social media platforms. The site helps to save work that otherwise would be lost, becoming a digital Dropbox and archive, to help inspire people in the future and remind us all that artists can help reshape the cruelty, inhumanity, and ugliness of war. In Place of War, this is the story of the artists. Watch it unfold here.
Thank you very much.
James, thank you for a fascinating, a fantastic and an incredibly thought-provoking lecture. And the one comment I want to make before we ask for questions is that it reinstates to me the importance of arts and humanities to this university and to society. Thank you, James.
Thanks.
So James has agreed to take a few questions from the audience. We have got some roving microphones, so if you want to put up your hand, you can ask a question. I should say that earlier in the evening, a few of James's colleagues were quite shocked because it's the first time we've ever seen him in a tie and a jacket. That didn't last long, anyway. So we've got a question down at the front. Have we got a microphone? Down here, and then we've got one a bit further up and in the middle. And we'll go to the one just behind, and then we'll go to you.
I'll probably articulate this terribly, but I'd like to ask, with a website like In Place of War, how much do you have to moderate the kind of content that goes on there? Because some of the art that you're showcasing could have the opposite effect. Probably a bad example is something like hip-hop. Some might say that that art form brings violence from other shores to our own shore. And surely that could happen with other projects you do when you expose them to wider audiences. This is a great question. At the moment, the way we work the archive bit of the site and the way people contribute to it is moderated. And at the moment, an artist or an artist group or an organisation has to apply to us for what we call an artist pass. Once they get the pass, they can then post. Of course, the decision about which artists can and can't post is extremely difficult. And we don't claim that we've got an easy answer to this. But at the moment, we are confident that certain types of representation wouldn't get through that process. But also, we want to allow it to be open. We want the sense that there is a community out there who will start to self-moderate. And we've seen other versions of sort of websites like this where, over a period of time, there is a sort of internal moderation. At the moment, it's sort of in a beta version of it. But it is a very serious issue. But in all the research we've done on artists in war, we will always see this. The idea that simplistically some there's artists whose work ameliorates and makes things better, and all artists are in that category is completely wrong. There are many artists who are using their art for extremely negative reasons, to promote disharmony, to promote racism, to promote all sorts of things that we would not sympathise with. And in much of the research in the project, we found amazing projects, and we also found deeply disturbing ones.
Question just behind you, and then we'll go up towards the middle.
So yeah,
I think, just speak. I think it'll be okay.
Okay. Your project name is very heading back home because I'm an Afghan refugee and I have lived all my childhood in conflicts and wars. You mentioned all the projects that is happening around the world, but are you having any plans to participate in projects in Afghanistan or Iraq, because it's the recent wars? And I think it will be better to have artists having a humanitarian intervention rather than a military intervention, because that is not a solution. And would it not be a better solution to do such a project and artists gets involved before the war happens to tell people the ugly pace of war? Because doing it after war, there isn't really much point. And also...
There's a challenge for you, James.
Thanks. And what is more important, justice or reconciliation? It's the question is in terms of Palestine and Israel. Thank you.
Yeah, we have very good connections with two organisations working in Afghanistan, and there are some amazing theatre programmes, particularly in Kabul and the areas around there. Particularly the focus of the one that I know most about in Kabul and Afghanistan is around women's rights and working with widows and family members who've lost people in the conflict over many years in Afghanistan. So there are some fantastic theatre projects in Afghanistan. During the early part of the In Place of War project, we had an Iraqi director over here working with us, so we have some connections in those areas. Before war, actually what we noticed in the project is the idea simplistically of a before, during and after is often more cyclical. Most of the work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's impossible to know whether they are before, during or after. In the time we've been working there, people have died at that moment. People call it a post-conflict area, but there's still... So actually there's theatre projects that exist trying to prevent wars breaking out again during war and in a post-conflict setting. Reconciliation or justice, the point is it's not for me to project and say what people should be doing, but to notice that there's a tension between them, rather than saying you must do reconciliation projects or you must do justice projects. I'm trying to illustrate that there's a difference.
In the middle? Thank you.
James, in a sense, you make a claim in place of war. And it could be a large claim or it could be a smaller claim. And in the smaller claim, you move along the time axis and these kinds of things emerge as war has passed. Adorno didn't even want to make the smaller claim. Picasso wanted to make the much larger claim. Is there a larger claim to be made?
First of all, I would say that the many smaller claims are worth valuing. I think one of the dangers of war zones, it's full of people who make very large claims, and one of the things that starts war is grand claims. And something really attractive to me about many of the artists is the quality of the smaller claim. It's about how people can live together. So first of all, small claims ain't bad. But there is a larger claim. Yeah, I think there is a role for artwork that is instead of, in the second meaning of in place of war. And I think actually, again, it's some of the smaller things about acts of celebration in spite of the bombing, acts of making beautiful things despite the situation in which people find themselves. So it's some of that work that is counter to, that I think actually provides people with a survival mechanism. And I think that is quite a bold claim.
Okay, question there?
Yeah, hello. My question is about your timeline. You stopped in 1962.
Yeah.
But I've noticed since 1962, and in fact just before, the response of the West often was satire and humour. You think of the Goons, you think of Catch-22, you think even of TV programme MASH. Did you develop any work in the third world, where this is predominantly where you were working, around humour, satire, and just generally finding an upside of beauty in humour?
I'll give you two examples. Thank you, Mike. A newer historian would... firstly, rumours suggest that just before the bombing of Baghdad, the comedy clubs were full. Now, that sounds trivial, but seriously, apparently there was a lot of comedy clubs in Baghdad, and they were packed to the rafters in the period leading up to the bombing. In a sense, that sense of deflection. Another example is in Lebanon. During the Israeli bombing of Lebanon, there was a project that was called Laughter Under the Bombs. And it took place in a large theatre that had become a refugee centre. And people had started assembling to live, because it was a stronger building, so they had assembled into this building, and they started living there. And a group of artists from the American University of Beirut went to the theatre and started running children's theatre workshops with the kids, other projects with the adults, and just activity during the day. And it became a project called Laughter Under the Bombs, because they sought to celebrate and give people a sense of community in the midst of the things that were happening outside. So there are these examples of humour. Also, lots of people talk about humour sort of prior to situations as well as after situations.
Right at the back.
It's me, Jane.
Hello.
It's a difficult one. It's quite related to the first question. I'm interested in your experience in Sri Lanka, where you seem to go back to traditional forms. And I suppose, thinking about it, it's like possibly saying an analogy would be, after the war, the Second World War, everybody went back to do maypole dancing. So, and I'm not trying to be frivolous at all, but that kind of comparison about the old Hindu epics being revived, was there a sense of censorship and almost like a void of external influences like hip-hop, street dance? Did it stop and then did it accelerate afterwards?
One of the remarkable things about, back to my map, is if you think about the history of colonialisation of Sri Lanka, is people entered from the west and very rarely reached the east. The Portuguese came in via the east, and therefore they were quite protected in this area. And also, paradoxically, the war protected some of the art forms because there was very little external influence. It allowed some of the traditional forms to survive, but what it did is, in a sense, made them valued. It didn't necessarily make them very strong because people couldn't perform, but there was a sense in these communities there wasn't much external influence. there was a real value in the traditional performance forms that they had. And I think that's what they were tapping into.
Question down here.
Can you hear me? Right.
Yes, hello.
I think, James, one of my concerns about the whole lecture, or perhaps about your whole course, is almost the flippancy with which you treat war. I think it's the most horrific, and those who have ever been involved in it see it as something which must be avoided at all costs. When you talked about Wilfred Owen talking, he was saying never, ever, ever again. And the idea that, and at times I think your vision of war is almost medieval, in as much as there's the Protestants against the Catholics, the Rwandans against the Tutus. War is now used as part of the capitalist system. It's imperialism. We have imperialist wars. We've seen them now in Vietnam. We've seen them now in Iraq. We're seeing it in Afghanistan. We all no doubt see it in Syria. Well, we are seeing it in Syria. And you're almost, somebody said about dancing around the maypole. That's almost what it is. I think people should be screaming, like you mentioned Guernica. Now, those who have seen Guernica realize it may have been a painting, but it was also it screamed, no more war, no more war. And I don't see anything within your, in place of war. It's not, it's in the same place as war. I think that you should be more anti-war than you are watching it and not enjoying it, but almost as an adjunct to it.
I definitely don't enjoy war. And I definitely don't treat war frivolously. One of the important things about this research project was not me saying what I thought was happening in war zones. That's why we didn't do the historical timeline. The important thing about this project was going to communities in war zones and saying, what do you value? Because people haven't asked them. People have tended to project onto war zones and say, what do we think is happening in this setting? People project that it should be Romeo and Juliet, Hutus and Tutsis. That is medieval. And that's why I'm saying I reject that.
Thank you. It's often mentioned that the people who are in the middle of a conflict, who experience it the most, do not want to talk about it. Now, my brother was in D-Day. He was in the Navy. His ship was sunk. He was rescued by a second ship, and then the second ship was sunk, and he miraculously survived. Now, in 50 years, he never spoke of that. You could never get any detail. Now, this may be a problem, that those who are absolutely in war don't want to talk about it. And we used to talk about line shooters, people who are not really in conflict, but they described it so graphically. So what you're doing possibly is to allow people who were in the conflict, in the middle, in the suffering, to somehow express something, not necessarily describing what they experienced, but what they feel.
I absolutely accept and agree with this statement. You notice many people who experience terrible things in the middle of war, whose decision is to stay silent about that event. Our job, I think, is to respect their silence, not say that that's the best response or the worst response, but to respect them for that position. What you notice, that just because they're silent about the immediate experience of the horror that they might have lived through, doesn't mean that they don't become artists. We saw projects which were projects of dance projects, drumming projects, for people directly involved in the war. Silence in response to your personal experience, it can be very loud. You can do a lot of other things because you don't want to talk about that thing. And that is something that in a sense, part of the message is here, is we should respect those decisions. rather than assuming that we know best how people should live through war, especially if we haven't been in the middle of that situation. So I wholly agree with that point.
We're going to take one more up at the back, and then I'm going to invite her. Thanks.
Hi, just one quick question. With any of your work, have you brought people together, different ethnic groups together that have been fighting, or different ethnic men together that have been fighting with any of your work?
Certainly my original work in Sri Lanka, when I was in the north of Sri Lanka, it was 100% Tamil from that particular community. But over many years of working there, I've worked across community, both communities together and also in separate communities. And there is a huge amount of work that in respectful ways can bring different communities together. I think it can be done glibly, and that's my point about Romeo and Julietism. But there are some very, very well-meaning, well-constructed projects that are trying to develop dialogue between communities, particularly, but not often in this 0-0 point. A lot of the international community are desperate to fund projects at that point, when it's too early for communities to actually start doing work together when the bombs, you know, it's later, it's in the middle area, later on, where you can start to do work that brings communities together.
Okay, so I'm going to invite Janine Watson, who's president of your Alumni Association, to give a vote of thanks to Jane. Hi, Janine.
Thank you, James. We've had a very powerful series of Cockcroft Rutherford lectures, and you've been an outstanding example of oratorial skills and your evocative imagery. It's been a fascinating experience, and for me in particular, I grew up as a child in Northern Ireland, and I arrived as a 7-year-old Church of Scotland young girl, and in my first lunchtime at school I was taken aside and tested on whether I could better sing The Sash Your Father Wore or The London Derriere. And I actually could sing neither of them, but my parents were so horrified by this that I suppose I was an early adopter in your art culture. And I was made, along with other children from local schools, to sing to Sandy Shaw's Puppet on a String and dance to Mary Hopkins. Those were the days, my friend. So your stories struck strongly with me. And the work that we're doing in local authorities just now across Greater Manchester, we're using culture to deal with some of the young people that have been affected and drama by the sexual abuse trials, which are terrible experiences, but they're very powerful ways of connecting with people. So your lectures have been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. On behalf of all the alumni in the room, I'd like to say, you know, we really appreciate that. It's been illuminating, and we have a small token here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. I'm going to take my seat.
I've also got some other thank yous to say to Nancy for introducing the lecture, but particularly to the team from the Alumni Relations Division who worked very hard to put this together. What I'd like to do is, if there are any of them still in the room, could you just step forward and give a wave so that we can show our appreciation. Come forward, Kate. A huge tribute to the University Challenge team. I can't tell you what wonderful Monday evenings you've given us in our household, where we have a very complex scoring system. We have to say something first before any of you say it, otherwise our scores don't count. But it was a wonderful experience, and I was particularly thrilled to see you here tonight being honoured, because last year Nancy inveigled some of us to come to an informal quiz evening. And I'm looking at Will here, I'm sure he has memories. We turned up at the informal quiz evening to find that we were going head to head with the University Challenge winners for the entertainment of everybody else in the room. If you think you showed a dismal performance, can I just say, we took the crown from you on that. We were humiliated. But we were told that that was our role in the proceedings. So, but Stephen was wonderful, and he did coach us. And I'm sorry, Stephen, we let you down so badly. But as you leave the theatre, I'd encourage you to linger in the entrance. There are some stalls where faculties have got some information about courses available or other issues of interest that you might find interesting. So I'd like to say very much thank you to everyone who's come along. I think it's been a great experience, really fascinating. It's challenged us all to think about it. So again, if we could just say thanks to James, to everybody else involved.